Hello, YouTubers. I hope everything is well. John 18, verse 36 reads, Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. In this video, I want to talk about what Jesus actually means here. And I want to start by talking about what he does not mean. If we look back just a few chapters earlier, chapter 15, verse 19, Jesus says this of his disciples. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. The first thing that we should notice is that Jesus is not saying to his disciples that they exist in a different realm, as you'll see some translations in John 18, that the kingdom is not of this realm. Well, he's not saying you disciples don't exist on this earth, but in a separate, distinct realm apart from the earth. If we look to Luke chapter 17, verses 20 through 21, it reads, Being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, he answered, The kingdom of God is not coming in ways that can be observed, nor will they say, Look, here it is, or there. For behold, the kingdom of God is in the midst of you. It's in the midst of you. It's right here in the midst. Jesus coming has brought the kingdom in the midst of everyone in the realm that they are in now, the earthly realm. To get a better clarification of what Jesus is saying, and to understand this the way John is using it, I think we can go to the book of James. And let me read from that as well. James 3, starting in verse 13. It says, Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. James is using some similar language here. Jesus in the Gospel of John, I am from above, you are from below. You are not of this world. If you were of the world would love you. My kingdom is not of this world. When we start looking at this language and understanding it the way the authors intended it, and we also look back to the Synoptic Gospels, we'll understand that he does not mean that this is a spiritual kingdom off into the realms of cosmic space or something like that. What he means is that the ethics of this kingdom are unlike the ethics of the human structures in the kingdoms of men. That passage in James, if you haven't put it together yet, is referencing back to Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, Blessed are the meek, the peacemakers. He talks about turning the other cheek. And if we remember when the Jews were coming to arrest Jesus, Peter pulls out his sword and cuts off the servant's ear, and Jesus says, Peter, put back your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So what Jesus is saying, my servants wouldn't have been fighting is he's already taught about the upside downness of the kingdom of God in comparison with the kingdom that are ruled by men. What is the kingdom of God? What does that really mean? I'm going to read from the Gospel of the Kingdom, George Eldon Ladd. This is a really good book, by the way. And on page 21, he says, the kingdom of God is his kingship, his rule, his authority. When this is once realized, we can go through the New Testament and find passage after passage where this meaning is evident, where the kingdom is not a realm or a people, but God's reign. Jesus said that we must receive the kingdom of God as little children. What is received? The church, heaven. What is received is God's rule. In order to enter the future realm of the kingdom, one must submit himself in perfect trust to God's rule here and now. This is kind of an ancient understanding of what kingdom would mean, and in our societies today, we have a different connotation of what kingdom means. But when the kingdom of God is in the midst of you, the kingdom is not from this world. It is the rule of God among men. And the place where that rule is not off into outer space or different from where we are now. John's gospel was loved by the Gnostics in ancient times. The Gnostics, like Valentinus, loved John's gospel, as well as do modern Gnostics today because of the language. But I think John's gospel is actually pretty brilliant, because what he'll do is he'll take this kind of like this dualistic language, but within his gospel, he's showing you what he really means. And what he really means is not the way the Gnostic or the Greek Hellenistic readers would use to assert what he was teaching, Gnosticism or Greek Hellenism. That's not what he's doing. The problem is, and this problem is also made by those who go into the book of John and almost solely use the book of John to prove that Jesus existed as a person, a spirit, literally off in eternity somewhere, and then came down to be incarnated in a body. If you read in the book of John, that is not what he means. So John will catch you there. John 6:51 says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So while Valentinus and other Gnostics would use the book of John and almost solely the book of John to prove their doctrine, they're really not taking John in context of the book. Same as with those people who would say the kingdom is a kingdom that is only spiritual, meaning it has nothing to do with this physical earth. They're not looking at the context of the book of the John or the way he uses that language. John starts off in the first chapter in his prologue saying the Word became flesh. Here we see John 6, the bread that came down from heaven is the flesh. At the end of the book, the disciples are touching Jesus. And when you go to the first epistle of John, you will see that which we have touched. John, because he is combating Gnosticism, places a very great deal of emphasis on touching and seeing what is there. But he uses this dualistic language. But if you take the Gospel of John alongside with the Synoptics, which is what you are supposed to do, then you will keep from being in error. So what I'm seeing is people taking things that Jesus say in the book of John in such a quote-unquote spiritual manner, and they're disregarding what the Synoptics say, and they're being caught in the trap. What Jesus is talking about, my kingdom is not of this world, is the ethics of the kingdom do not originate from human structures. It comes from God. And as I said earlier, James is talking about earthly wisdom versus wisdom that comes from above. He's pointing back to the Sermon on the Mount. What does Jesus say on the Sermon on the Mount? In Matthew 5:5, he says this, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And as I read from George Ladd, you see the kingdom being God's will, God's reign, God's sovereignty among men. Also on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:10, and you see the synonymous parallelism, very common in Hebrew literature. Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray. And he says to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The coming of God's kingdom is God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. And we know that Jesus gave us the true meaning of prophecy. So when Jesus teaches on the kingdom of God in the synoptics, you can see in the Sermon on the Mount and the kingdom parables where he is referencing Old Testament prophecy like Psalm 37. I'm going to turn to that and I'm going to read just a few things from Psalm 37. Jesus has said, "The meek shall inherit the earth." Okay. Verses 9 and 10. "For evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land. Yet a little while, and the wicked man will be no more. And you will look carefully for his place, and he will not be there. But the humble will inherit the land, and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity." Later on in this chapter, verses 18 through 22, "The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their inheritance will be forever. They will not be ashamed in the time of evil, and in the days of famine they will have abundance. But the wicked will perish, and the enemies of the Lord will be like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke. They vanish away. The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. For those blessed by him will inherit the land, but those cursed by him will be cut off." Verses 28-29, "For the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his godly ones. They are preserved forever. But the descendants of the wicked will be cut off. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever." Verse 34, "Wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you will see it." And then there's Proverbs chapter 2. This is a very good one. Verses 21 and 22. "For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, the treacherous will be uprooted from it." Now let's think about this for just a second. Let's use some logic. You cannot be cut off from a land in which you never were. You cannot be uprooted from a land in which you were never planted in. So if anyone wants to quote-unquote spiritualize this, they have to ignore that logic. But the greatest proof that Jesus is talking about the kingdom being on earth and the wicked being uprooted out of the earth is in the parables that he gives. Let's get to the parable of the tares and the wheat. And keep in mind this language of being cut off and uprooted when we read this parable. Jesus is actually teaching on the kingdom of God here. Matthew 13, starting at verse 24. This is the parable of the tares among the wheat. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. The slaves said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat to my barn. Now when Jesus explains this parable, verse 37 of the same chapter, and he said, The one who sows this good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age. And the reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness. And the King James verse says, all things that offend. And will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. The field is the world. If we go to 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, verse 6, that he planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. So the seed, which is the gospel of the kingdom, is being sowed in the world. In Corinth, in Thessalonica, throughout the ends of the earth. Jesus says the field is the world. He says, at the end of the age, all things that offend will be uprooted, plucked up out of his kingdom. The kingdom is sown in the world. When we go back to those Psalms, and we go back to Proverbs, and we understand what John is saying in chapter 18, in light of what Jesus actually teaches about synoptics, it will keep us from this spiritualization or so-called spiritualization of saying that Jesus is saying one thing, but it's not what he's actually saying. Go to where he actually teaches. One of the best places that we know what Jesus is teaching and drawing from is in Daniel 2. Let me read that too. The vision that Nebuchadnezzar had and Daniel tells him what his dream was. Daniel 2 verse 31, You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. The kingdom of God is in the midst of you. And what Jesus has taught, which is what the prophets taught, which is what the psalmists taught, which is what Solomon taught in Proverbs. Jesus comes and brings the mystery of the kingdom, that the kingdom is going to start small. It's not going to be right away. But it is going to grow and fill the entire earth. And at the end of the age, the tares will be uprooted out of it, and the righteous will shine forth. Do we believe Jesus? See, I've heard that comment made, and it's really easy to take Jesus out of context and then make a claim that you need to believe my interpretation or you're not believing Jesus. If you're going to believe Jesus, you need to believe Jesus in context, and you need to actually look at what he taught. And what he teaches is that this earth is where the kingdom is, where the rule of man, and teaches his disciples how to pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That God is not going to just bypass this earth and just let it go and to let sin continue and reign. No, that God's reign will come, and God will be all in this earth, and he will be sovereign, and he will be one. And that's what Jesus teaches, and that's not different from the Jewish concept, which is his background as a rabbi. They understood these things for the majority. That's what Jesus teaches. Do we believe Jesus? Do we believe what he says? God bless you guys.